Also, there's another notable scholar that, again, we said we were going to mention, Dr. John Henry Clark. He is responsible for the social studies portion of the American baseline essays, African-American baseline essays. Dr. John Henry Clark is somebody that is, he's been a very notable activist. He's the most notable name that I know as far as authors of the essays that Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III picked out for the baseline essays. And he has an awesome story, He wrote an article entitled A Search for Identity. When I was thinking about how to introduce Dr. John Henry Clark to the people, obviously there's a wealth of information on him that others have written about him. But when I found this particular article, I was going to go with the same type of approach as the obituary of Dr. Asa G. Hilliard, where, it's kind of just giving out all of his credentials and his life and stuff like that. But this struck me. When I read this, it really struck me. And I thought that because his portion of the essays is social studies, this qualifies him beyond any diploma. If he tells you his life story, it qualifies him beyond any diploma for this particular portion of social studies. When you're talking about social studies in African America, you feel me? Somebody that's experienced the social situation would know, firsthand. Forget a diploma, he was there, So this is why I decided to read his article entitled A Search for Identity by John Henry Clark. Now, Dr. Clark passed in 1998, which is 11 years ago. And he wrote this particular article in May of 1970. He writes, "My own search for an identity began, as I think it begins for all young people, a long time ago when I looked at the world around me and tried to understand what it was all about. My first teacher was my great-grandmother, who we called Mom Mary. She had been a slave first in Georgia and later in Alabama, where I was born in Union Springs. It was her who told us the stories about our family and about how it had resisted slavery. More than anything else, she repeatedly told us the story of Buck, her first husband, and how he had been sold to a man who owned a stud farm in Virginia. Stud farms are an aspect of slavery that has been omitted from the record and about which we do not talk anymore. We should remember, however, that there were times in this country when owners used slaves to breed stronger slaves in the same way that a special breed of horses used to breed other horses. My great-grandmother had 3 children with Buck. My grandfather Jonah, my grand-aunt Lisa, who was a midwife, and another child. With Buck, Mom Mary had as close to a marriage as a slave can have. Marriage was with the permission of the respective masters. Mom Mary had a lifelong love affair with Buck. And years later, after the emancipation, she went to Virginia and searched for him for 3 years. She never found him, and she came back to Alabama, where she spent the last years of her life. Mom Mary was a historian of our family. Years later, when I went to Africa and listened to oral historians, I knew that my great-grandmother was not very different from the old men and women who sat around in front of their houses to tell the young children the stories of their people. How they came from one place to another, how they searched for safety, and how they tried to resist the Europeans who came to their lands. This great-grandmother was so dear to me that I have defied her in almost the same way. This great-grandmother was so dear to me that I have deified her in almost the same way that many Africans deify their old people. I think that my search for identity, my search for what the world was about, and my relationship to the world began when I listened to the stories of that old woman. I remembered that she always ended the stories in the same way that she said goodbye or good morning to people. It was always with a reminder: run the race and run it with faith. She was a deeply religious woman in a highly practical sense. She did not rule out resistance as a form of obedience to God. She thought that the human being should not permit himself to be dehumanized. And her concept of God was so pure and so practical, and she could see that resistance to slavery was a form of obedience to God. She did not think that any of us children should be enslaved, and she thought that anyone who had enslaved any one of God's children had violated the very will of God. I think Buck's pride in his manhood was a major force that always made her revere her relationship with him. He was a proud man, and he resisted. One of the main reasons for selling him to a man to use on a stud farm was that he could breed strong slaves whose wills the master would then break. This dehumanizing process was a recurring aspect of slavery. Growing up in Alabama, my father was a brooding, landless sharecropper, always wanting to own his own land. But on my father's side of the family, there had been no ownership of land at all. One day, after a storm had damaged our farm and literally blown the roof off of our house, he decided to take his family to Mill City, Columbus, Georgia. He had hoped that one day he would make enough money to return to Alabama as an independent farmer. He pursued this dream for the rest of his life. Ultimately, the pursuit of this dream killed him. Now he has a piece of land, 6 feet deep, and the length of his body. That's as close as he ever came to being an independent owner of land. In Columbus, I went to county schools, and I was the first member of the family of 9 children to learn to read. I did so by picking up signs, grocery handbills, and many other things that people threw away into the street. And by studying the signboards, I knew more about the different brands of cigarettes and what they contained than I knew about the history of the country. I would read the labels on tin cans and see where the products were made, and these scattered things were my first books. I remember one day picking up a leaflet advertising that the Ku Klux Klan was riding again. Because I had learned to read early, great things were expected of me. I was a Sunday school teacher of the junior class before I was 10 years old. And I was the one person who would stop at the different homes in the community to read the Bible to the old ladies as a 10-year-old boy. Wow. In spite of growing up in such abject poverty, I grew up in a very rich cultural environment that had its oral history and with people who not only cared for me, but also pampered me in many ways. So despite, the oppression, you felt pampered. Unbelievable. I know that this kind of upbringing negates all the modern sociological explanations of black people that assume that everybody who was poor was without love. I had love of plenty and appreciation of plenty, all of which gave me a sense of self-worth that many young black children never develop. I began my search for my people first in the Bible. I wondered why all the characters, even those who, like Moses, were born in Africa, were white. Reading the description of Christ as swarthy and with hair like sheep's wool, I wondered why the church depicted him as blonde and blue-eyed. Where was the hair like sheep's wool? Where was the swarthy complexion? I looked at the map of Africa, and I knew Moses had been born in Africa. How did Moses become so white? If he went down to Ethiopia to marry Zipporah, why was Zipporah so white? Who painted the world white? Then I began to search for the definition of myself and my people in relationship to world history. And I began to wonder how we had become lost from the commentary of world history.